Thank you, Jeremy. It is my great pleasure to introduce Melissa Higgins, who is our final student presenter in the symposium. Melissa is currently a student in the Library and Information Science program at the University of Denver. Previously, she studied English literature with a concentration on British literature at the University of South Carolina, and she got a master's in that area. In her current studies, she's primarily interested in digital collections, digital humanities, and the changing landscape of research in academic settings. Melissa will present her paper on social tagging, and it's titled Structure, Subjectivity, and Power, the Provisional Space of Libraries Within the Social Tagging Movement. And the area of social tagging has been really explored extensively, especially in image research. She's taking a rather unique perspective, adapting a theoretical framework and looking at the contextual information that can be gathered through social tagging. So I will let Melissa present her paper. Melissa, I'm turning the presentation to you.
Melissa, you'll need to start.
Hi, yes,
there you go.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining in to hear my presentation. So the title of my paper is Structure, Subjectivity, and Power, the Provisional Space of Libraries Within the Social Tagging Movement. So my research seeks to understand the shifting of libraries towards more user-centered methods of description through social tagging. And I was looking at the potential these trends offer and whether, theoretically, there's a difference between how users interact with social tagging and how libraries might make use of it. I was interested in looking specifically at how social tagging might be used in the context of academic and scholarly research in digital collections. So I'll go into this further in a moment, but my findings suggest that social tagging shows potential in being applied to descriptions of digital collections by providing context that controlled vocabularies can't hope to provide. Through social tagging, we more clearly see a recognition of the social and cultural significance of the objects described. During my research, I was intrigued by the argument of Gina Schlesselman-Tarango on the same subject, who in her 2013 paper, Searchable Signatures, Context and the Struggle for Recognition, asserted that Web 2.0 technologies and how people make use of them are manifestations of individual identities being reshaped in the fluid environment of the web. And because this user-generated content operates outside of, if not against, the established authority, it's an inherently political act. So I thought this was a very unique and insightful observation, but perhaps not quite the whole story. So in my research, I asked, how are libraries and institutions like them situated within this politicized landscape of individual subjective acts? My general approach was to examine the possibilities of social tagging in digital collections through two frameworks. The first is a more practical, use-based approach, looking at how context alters the process of research. And then my second framework involved taking a wider, more theoretical view of the relationship between users and institutions and how inherent differences in the actions and goals of each may affect how social tagging is utilized. So essentially taking a contextual view as a whole of the nature of institutions versus individuals. This theoretical approach involved examining the acts of social tagging through the lens of Michael de Certeau's theories from the practice of everyday life. In it, he argues that individuals subvert the structures created by institutions through simple acts in everyday life. And for de Certeau, the individuals exist through the use of tactics, while institutions exist through the use of strategies. But more on that later. My research for these frameworks led me to conclude that social tagging shows great potential of use in digital collections because of how it gathers social and cultural context about an object from collective knowledge. However, as I argue, libraries as institutions occupy a liminal space between the needs of institutions and those of individuals. So this unique position means libraries' adoption of social tagging, while necessary for adapting to increasingly connected and collaborative culture, always exists in a provisional space between the assertions of strategies and the insertions of tactics. And hopefully that second framework I'm dealing with will become clear by the end of my presentation. So first, let's get some context about the role of social tagging in libraries today. There are many pros and cons that have been talked about between social tagging and controlled vocabularies. Social tagging is often seen as more democratic and inclusive. It allows users more control over the description process. They can be more comprehensive and reflect, as I said, the social and cultural meanings of the objects being described. They also often more accurately reflect the ways that users are actually searching in the web environment, and social tagging reflects an increased concern in libraries for the user experience. Digital collections in recent years have found them especially useful, as we will see later on in the presentation, because they can gather more information about an object from using collective knowledge. Social tagging does have several drawbacks as well, which include problems of relevancy, meaning the tags may be too specific or too broad, and you end up retrieving unnecessary information. They can also often be redundant due to multiple spellings or multiple ways of conveying the same idea, or they can be altogether incorrect, whether they are misspelled or the subject is entirely mistaken. So for this research, in order to assess how social tags work compared to controlled vocabularies, I chose a subject of personal academic interest to me, the novel Ulysses by James Joyce. I chose to look at the social networking site Flickr and compare it to the National Library of Ireland's digital collections, and search for photographs of significant geographical locations in Dublin, which are featured in the novel. So right here is an example of images found in Flickr in the National Library of Ireland when searching for Davy Burns's pub in Dublin. The National Library of Ireland contains over 34,000 digitized glass plate negative photographs, while Flickr contains over 4 billion photographs. Flickr allows up to 75 individual tags for each photo, although I found that the average was actually closer to 15, and also allows space for description of the photograph as well as a comment section. The National Library of Ireland uses controlled vocabularies to create subject headings, and it allows for users to facet their search based on year, collection, geography, author, genre, etc. So for my research, I chose 10 prominent locations from the novel to search for on each site, and I found all except for one of those locations on both. The 10th location was found on neither. To provide a specific example of the research I did, if I do a search for Martello Tower at Sandy Cove in Dublin, which is a significant location in the novel, a key difference between social tagging in Flickr and controlled vocabularies of the National Library of Ireland start to appear. Just the title of the photograph on Flickr, Joyce's Martello Tower, demonstrates a key characteristic of user tagging compared to controlled vocabularies. So this is not the formal name of the tower, it's just known as the Martello Tower, but this one was assigned by the individuals whose personal and cultural associations are overlaying the subject. Other user tags include Bloomsday, James, and Joyce, and each of these represents a cultural interpretation of the subject. The tags could potentially include terms such as British, forts, and the French Revolution, because these specific structures were originally built by the British Empire to defend Ireland during the French Revolution. But the tags that they were given instead imbue them with a different meaning, which is inspired by a more recent and probably more popular cultural context. So if I search for a photograph of this Martello Tower in the National Library of Ireland catalog, on the other hand, we get photographs whose subject headings are restricted by the information of its initial capture. Only 3 subjects, as you see, are provided by which users may discover this early photograph: Martello Towers, Ireland, and the date range 1900 to 1920. We could search specific collections too, but the name of the collection doesn't really tell us much about what it contains. The first 2 subject headings can be found as mini social tags on the Flickr photographs as well, but the last one, the date range in which the image was taken, has particular significance. As a cultural heritage institution, it's important for the National Library of Ireland to document as best as possible the specific instance of capture. Out of all 10 searches that I did, these tentative dates are the best representation of context that the library provides. All other associations or meanings must be filled in by the researchers. On the other hand, Flickr provides the date that the photo was added to the website, but rarely do users themselves indicate the date the photo itself was captured. This is important because, from the perspective of the researcher, the difference between seeing the tower as it looks today and seeing it as it looked to James Joyce at the turn of the century is significant. While time, unfortunately, doesn't permit me to go through all 10 examples that I looked for in this research, the same principles did hold up for each of my individual searches. Photographs in Flickr demonstrated distinct social and cultural associations, whether they were events, people, or other nearby landmarks. The National Library of Ireland's digital collection, on the other hand, was always limited to describing the collection, the year range, and the geographic location. It's also worth noting another key difference that I found during my research, which is how users might actually search within each system. Flickr consists of a single search field into which users may type anything they like. Searching on Flickr, I propose it's like the throwing out of a wild net, where you're likely to retrieve both related and unrelated results. So a net is not as precise per se, but if you can remember one contextual keyword, you're bound to capture something. The National Library of Ireland, on the other hand, has a single search field, but also faceted searching through which users can narrow down the search based on specific criteria. So rather than a net, this faceted system of searching operates, I propose, like a maze of doors that can be opened or closed on new avenues of inquiry. Faceted searching does enable new methods of search and retrieval, but entrance into that process is only as open as the structure that built it. Semantic user-driven vocabulary that acknowledges the importance of context is one that more closely resembles the mind of the information seeker, even though it lacks structure. So we're finding out that people would probably rather throw a net than risk getting lost in a maze. Another interesting aspect about my research was that the National Library of Ireland also maintained its own Flickr site, the National Library of Ireland on the Commons, which adopts social networking and tagging methods. Here the library posts photos about which librarians might know very little, and so they invite users to provide historical and cultural input through tags and through the discussion forum. They were able to figure out in this example that apparently there are both bowler hats and Coke hats in this photograph, although I haven't found the bath chair yet. And in the discussion forum for this photo, users were able to pinpoint the date range of this photo by examining the kinds of street lights that were present in the photo. So in this way, libraries invite the authority of collective knowledge, and in doing so, open up a new use for Flickr. A researcher has the capability of finding relevant and period-specific photos that have rich social tags without irrelevancy or redundancy in the social tagging environment. And this trend has the power to provide richness and to facilitate new kinds of academic inquiry. So far, I've been discussing my first framework, which situates social tagging as a method of utilizing collective knowledge, as well as adding contextual richness. Here, though, I want to introduce a second framework for my approach to social tagging in libraries, which you can envision as a theoretical blanket that overlays everything I've so far discussed. In the practice of everyday life, Michel Desserteau posited that institutions of authority and production, which were previously thought to control the social narrative and to directly inform how people interact with the world, were in fact constantly being undermined by the everyday actions of individuals, which we can call, and he called, tactics. Tactics are in opposition to the strategies of those in power. Desserteau defined tactics as ways of, quote, making do, or as a disguise. So mundane actions and everyday objects are reshaped by the individual to take on new functions. And for Desserteau, therefore, there is no passive consumption. In his own elegant analogy of a man walking through a city, an individual disregards the sidewalks, the streets, and the designated paths that were put into place by the infrastructure when they're walking through the city. Instead, the individual constructs their own meaningful route. The problem we arrive at, then, is that libraries themselves are institutions as well as producers. They serve and receive power from bureaucratic authoritative systems that for Desserteau are the antithesis of individuals. Yet they can also be subversive. Libraries house and encourage subversive intellectual thought. I argue that this means libraries occupy a sort of tricky liminal space that has implications not only for social tagging, but in all of the ways libraries negotiate user-driven systems versus institutionally driven ones. For example, the National Library of Ireland on the Commons Flickr photos in a way celebrates the collective knowledge of the community, but at the same time, the purpose is to glean that collective knowledge and fold it back within the existing system of authority control. So their goal is to take these messy, subjective descriptions by users and reshape them once again into these strategic, objectively true descriptions of the controlled vocabularies. Thus, libraries that utilize social tagging systems are once in a way conceding power, but simultaneously shifting to regain control in other ways. A library using social tags, then, is not by itself revolutionary and doesn't really represent a true change in the direction. For de Certeau, though, institutions are not wholly separate from individuals. Institutions can be seen as more like a sieve, which is full of leaky holes through which individual tactics are constantly penetrating. And so as through a sieve, the influence of these individual tactics used by people in their everyday lives flow into libraries and influence them. But libraries themselves as institutions are not tactical. Their one true strategy is to make order of disorder. So libraries can use social tagging, but their use will be framework-oriented. Users will always operate outside of this system, reshaping it in ways that libraries cannot. So I've tried to show in this presentation that social tagging, in terms of its ability to harvest the collective knowledge of communities, and in order to describe objects so that they can be easily retrieved, is very promising. But I've also tried to suggest as well that while digital collections can and should use these methods, since social tagging is essentially a tactical rather than a strategic method of description, they cannot really incorporate them in the true sense of that word. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Melissa. Are there any questions? I don't see any questions in the chat room. Oh, actually, there are some now. I can see. Melissa, can you see there is a question about looking, when looking for Flickr, did you find much of the way of purposeful tolling of term?
Can you clarify that?
Chris, can you grab the mic maybe?
Oh, trolling. I see. Trolling. Not particularly with the instances that I looked at, because I was looking specifically at geographic locations that I didn't. There were a lot of irrelevant terms that I found where people would, you know, like, for example, the Davy Burns' pub in Dublin, things about, you know, drinking and debauchery, stuff like that, that were just, would be unrelated if you were trying to do any kind of purposeful research, but not really in a trolling sense. I didn't find that.
Thank you, Melissa. There is one more question. What do you plan to do with this research?
Well, that's a very good question. I would love to expand it because, for example, obviously this research is just based on one example that really is only relevant to me and the small population of other people that enjoy Ulysses. So it would be interesting to see how it works in other contexts within a research environment, and then build on it in that way and see if you could expand it to other user-centered systems other than just simply social tagging.
Okay, and we have one more question from Arjun. Loved your presentation, but have a question about, have you found methods to map local subject headings, such as those used in archives, to social text and vice versa?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the beginning of that question. Oh, I see it here. No, I haven't actually looked into that yet specifically. That would definitely be, if I were to expand this research, which I hope to, that would, looking at how to map the subject headings back and forth in that way is definitely something that I should look at. So thank you very much for that suggestion.
We don't have any more questions, so I would like to thank you for your presentation. Thank you very much. And I believe we have a couple more minutes before the next presentation, so I'm going to turn the mic to Jeremy, who is going to load the next presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you, Melissa. Sorry. So I did just want to point out that that was the fourth and final of our presentations, as Christina noted during the introduction. So the judges from the presentation round are going to mull over their thoughts, and we'll be combining those scores and sort of announcing the Student Paper Award, Best Paper Award winners, hopefully by the end of next week. This is also a good time to point out, because we do have a couple of minutes before the next presentation is scheduled, so we will take a 5-minute break here in a minute. But I did just also want to use this as an opportunity to let the new folks who have joined since we discussed it last time, know that we will be making the recordings and materials from the symposium available. We hope to have some sort of a proceedings where you'll be able to see the student research papers, as well as some synopses or transcripts, write-ups, some sort of material also from the faculty and professional speakers as well. And so the recordings and such will be going up. If you would like to be notified of that, please use the RSVP form that is on the symposium website. But many of you, I recognize your names are already on there, but if you did not RSVP, obviously we don't need to know that you were here, are planning to be here, if you're not here already. But going forward, I'll be using that to just send out notifications to folks as the archival content from the symposium becomes available. So please feel free to sign up there. I promise I'm not going to spam you or sell your names to anyone, just letting you know when that material goes live.